Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the WideShut Webcast on WideShut.co.uk. This new video version on top of the weekly radio show on Resistance Radio. I'm not going to be covering the alternative news headlines this week. I've changed up the show this week, but you can find all of those at WideShut.co.uk. The main ones this week, one's entitled Climate Alarmists Look to Hollywood for Brainwashing Help. Basically, the global heads of this green agenda from the UN and so on, the IPCC, they've been in Hollywood for the Oscars week trying to win over directors and writers to produce more brainwashing for the green agenda. There's been Ban Ki-moon, Pachuri, all those people have been there in Hollywood trying to network so they can get some more brainwashing out there. The second headline that I wrote last week was Quiet Martial Law Coming to the UK, and this is the story of various agendas that are trying to bring troops onto UK soil, basically. They've listed the terrorist threat as an example. The protests, they're on about bringing in troops because of this stupid poking of Camilla in the royal car. I mean, what kind of an idiot drives head-on into a protest? But they're using that as one of the pretexts. The 2012 Olympics, where they've got to bring troops in because there's not enough police, apparently. All these different pretexts to bring in this stepping stone form of martial law. No, it's not full-blown martial law, but it's one step towards it. We're not supposed to have troops on the UK streets, period. But those are some of the alternative headlines that you can read on wideshut.co.uk and what I would ordinarily be covering today. But today's show is going to be a bit different. I'm going to be covering something that was brought up on the MistrBrit Extra show on Friday. And that's our good old friend Oscar the Engineer, who I actually think is quite a useful caller, because he tests our position, he forces us to argue our case, and he's not a truther. He's playing devil's advocate to us, basically. I think he just goes around different talk shows and calls in when he finds something interesting that he wants to talk about or that he can debate with people. And he's clearly not an idiot. I think he's a nice guy, and as I said, I think it brings the best out in Resistance Radio because we have to defend our position. Sometimes you can get a little comfortable with our audience who pretty much agree with what we say, and you can get a bit lazy in regards to presenting the information. So it's always good to get a kick up the arse with a caller that doesn't necessarily agree with you. Excuse me. He also said he was a listener to my show. So, egos aside, I just want to address what he was talking about on MistrBrit's show, and that's his views on the monetary system and the financial crisis. Because he does appear to be pro-cuts, and he made the case that people need to accept some of the responsibility for the recession. And there are several things I think he got wrong, and I'm going to go through those today. I'm going to play, what he said, then I'm going to go to what I think the facts are and what I've researched, and, we'll go from there.
First of all, this business about cuts, what was all that you were saying about, what's the name of this cuts campaign?
UK Uncut.
UK Uncut.
Yeah, have you not heard of that?
Well, the name rings a bell, and I suppose it's just talking about fighting against the concept of cuts. But
no, it's not just talking about it, it's physical action. They go around and shut down shops that have been avoiding corporate tax.
But do you not think that... Well, first of all, do you not think that the government is spending too much, and therefore by the logic of that, we do need cuts.
So Oscar's first point there was basically that we need cuts. Well, my answer to that is no, we don't need anything. We don't need any specific system. You know, we don't have to be in the system for life. We're in a system that has failed. What kind of advanced civilization are we where we're basically saying we have this system, this is how it is, this is how it's always been, and this is how it's always going to be. We're just going to have to accept these cuts because that's the way it is. Well, personally, I think it's quite clear that if that's the way it is, and that's the way it's always going to be, then we're always going to be in the shitter, and there's always going to be a rich, powerful elite. If the people become educated about the current system and demand a new system, then let's have a new system. Things evolve, ideas change. This notion that we just simply need cuts because that's the only way we could ever solve this because that's just the system, I fundamentally don't agree with that, because that's basically boxing humanity into one system and we're never going to progress ever again. That's ridiculous. And he was also sort of alluding to the UK Uncut movement. And although I agree that perhaps UK Uncut don't really get to the root of the problem, I've said that before, and they can come across as just whining about, you know, that we shouldn't have cuts without really explaining the system itself. But I think they're an important tool at pointing out the hypocrisy within the system. For example, George Osborne letting Vodafone off $6 billion in tax. It's important that people are aware of that. Or Philip Green of the Arcadia Group, who's paid himself a record bonus of 1.2 billion. Tax-free, that's the point, funneling it through offshore accounts to his wife in Monaco, who's been put on the books even though she's never worked a day's life in this company, in his conglomerate of different high street chains. And believe it or not, he was given a job to write a report for the government on government spending, yet he's the one getting away with not paying tax. That's the hypocrisy of the system. And before Cameron became Prime Minister, it was revealed on mainstream television, I think it was one of the panoramas, that he was accepting £50,000 in contributions from corporate figures to have lunch with him. So basically he would take backhanders and they could come in and say, well, if you get into power, we would like this, this and this done. Here's 50,000. I hope you can get that done for us, Mr. Cameron. So UK Uncut do a good job of explaining the corruption within the current system, and they show how the lower classes are the ones picking up the tab, and it's not a fair system, while a lot of the rich are obviously being let off. But as I've said before, they don't really get to the root problem, and that's the whole financial system itself. So I just thought I'd make those points that no, we don't simply need cuts because that's the way it is. I think that's a closed-minded way to look at things. But I also want to make the point that UK Uncut aren't necessarily adequately exposing the system, and Oscar may have sort of been sort of confused on our position on that matter. We don't simply want the cuts to stop because we don't want to pay cuts. It's deeper than that, and UK Uncut don't seem to get to that point. But that's what we're going to get to today.
Well, first of all, do you not think that the government is spending too much, and therefore, by the logic of that, we do need cuts?
But he kind of does that in a shrugging off sort of way. The government has spent too much. Well, yes, the government have spent too much, and the investors and institutions that lend to the government, some of those are offshore, some of those are on UK soil, some of it we don't even know because they don't keep adequate records about where the money's going or coming from. But they know that the people will be forced to pick up the tab in taxes and cuts. So borrowing to the government has traditionally, and still is, quite a safe investment, because the government force the people to pay it back. You can't run away from the national debt because the government enforce it through the cuts and the taxes. Now the point here is that it's the government that have spent too much, not the people, but it's the people that pick up the tab. You know, we have to pay for the EU, despite lots of people not wanting to be in the EU, and quite frankly we didn't get to vote to be in it in the first place. So there is one lot of money that is not in any way our fault. We have to pay for the illegal wars in the Middle East and the covert operations in the Middle East. Guess what? Millions of people protested in London in, I believe, 2003, and Tony Blair, who is an obvious liar that has been proven to be a liar time and time again, he carried on anyway against the people's wishes. So that's another expense that's been lumped on us that we didn't want. We have to pay for expensive green systems and bureaucracies based on the lie of global warming, arms deals, funding careless covert ops for MI6 that they fudge and we end up with blowback, or they directly undertake terrorism, that if the people knew that was going on they wouldn't accept it. We have to pay for our own slavery. We have CCTV, the trumped up anti-terror measures, new cyber security, you know, to defend us against the Stuxnet virus, which our allies in Israel happened to create. You know, us and our allies are the cyber terrorists, but we need this £1 million system to protect us from ourselves. It's quite ridiculous. And let's not forget, it was the MPs themselves that were caught fiddling their expenses. So yeah, the government, successive governments in fact, have spent too much in our name. And if you agree with everything the government does and everything successive governments have done, then fine, you pay the bill. It's not my debt and I don't want to pay it. It's as simple as that. Yes, the government has spent too much, and that's one of the fundamental problems with the financial system.
What do you mean?
Well, the public sector finances are in a terrible state, and there's only
is that your fault? Is that people's fault? Is that the average citizen of the UK's fault? No, it's not. It's the fault of the banks. It's the fault of the whole financial system.
Hang on a minute. It's the fault of a number of people. It's the fault of the government to an extent. It's the fault of the banks to an extent, but I think that they get a bit of a raw deal out of it, to be honest with you.
Is it the fault of the people who go around just doing the daily jobs? Is it their fault?
Yeah, certainly is. Certainly is the fault of some people. How?
Who and how?
Various different ways. What about people who, for example, foolishly borrow too much? Aren't they stupid? Well, no, but it all ends up contributing towards the overall problem, because it contributes to the financial crash that we've all experienced. It's not only the public sector, the government, although they are doing the same thing, and the banks, of course, were involved, but you have to place a lot of the onus for that on the stupid decisions that individuals en masse within society have made.
So it's the people borrowing too much. They need to take a lot of the blame. Well, this is in regard to the actual economic collapse itself, which is partly separate from the government borrowing issue, but has become interlinked when we bailed out the banks. But to rebut his statement, to rebut what Oscar said, we just have to look at who the winners are in this situation. Did the people who borrowed too much, did they win? No, they don't have their houses, and they're facing cuts for decades and decades to come. Who's still paying out ridiculous bonuses and recording billions of profits? The high street banks. So it's clear to me that the banks won in that situation. So do we blame the people who weren't educated about the monetary system at school, who were not informed by the alleged experts that were supposed to be advising them that it wasn't a good idea to take on these loans and these mortgages? Do we blame them if they get stacks and stacks of letters through the post, giving them credit cards, offering them ridiculous credit limits, and no need for background checks? Is that their fault that they take on these credit cards? No, it's not their fault. It's the institutions that coerce them onto this fishing line of credit that they then reel back in. You know, did they sit there and say, oh, this person can't pay it back, we better not give it to them? No, because they know they can make profits regardless of whether the person can pay it back or not. That's the point. Take mortgages. If somebody defaults, the lender gets the house anyway. The physical asset is worth more than the paper representing it, so in a way it's better for a bank if somebody defaults. But I think it's important to understand why the collapse occurred, to rebut what Oscar said. It wasn't the people that borrowed that caused the collapse. The people that borrowed, I'll admit, played a small role in whatever financial institution they were borrowing from, but it's not their fault. It was the people that lent it to them. That's part of doing business that they need to account for. Risk. That's always been part of the banking system. If you gave it to somebody that couldn't afford it and they defaulted and you lost a bit of money, that's your fault, because that's the business that you're in and that's what you've got to account for. But instead, they built up these huge bubbles that then burst and caused the collapse. If it was just simply people not being able to pay off their mortgages, then we wouldn't have had the collapse. But it's because they interlinked it with lots of different things that the whole system came crashing down. What they did was repackage the mortgages and then sell them on and on and on as derivatives. And they dressed them up as being more valuable when they were and less more valuable than they were and less risky than they were. Basically what happened was the banks, or the lenders, the institutions that gave out the mortgages, took large pools of these mortgages, called it derivatives, and then sold them as a financial product that other investors and banks could invest in, solely based on the idea that all those people could pay back their mortgages and make everybody rich. Well, over time, these derivatives got swapped. They got mixed with other investments, repackaged again, and basically this debt, this bubble, these bubbles, made their way all around the world in different financial systems under different names. You know, we're in a global financial system, so it is all interconnected to some degree anyway. And it was all on the basis that the borrowers could pay back their mortgages at the interest charge. It just became a giant bubble, literally gambling on whether it could be paid back or not. If it couldn't be paid back, then the banks and the investors lost the bet. But that's the important point to make. They bet and they lost. It's up to the banks to lend to people they trust. That's their business. If they're too stupid to assess that risk and put measures in place, and they fail because they've created this string of false credit, that's their fault for doing bad business. They knew a lot of these people couldn't pay back their mortgages, and they made the quick buck by selling it on anyway and getting other people to invest in it and reinvest and reinvest and reinvest until they didn't even know where the initial mortgage was or who it came from or who owns it. And you can use a simple analogy here. If I walked up to a homeless man and gave him £50 and said, right, you've got 10% interest, he's obviously not going to pay that back to me because he's a homeless man. And then I go to somebody else and say, well, I've got £55 coming in soon from this homeless man, but you call him a rich man. You know, you lie, you dress it up. He's not really homeless, he just likes to walk around on the streets because he enjoys walking. So if you give me £53 now, you can have the full 55 when I get it. Well, I do a runner with the 53, which is 3 more than I had to begin with, and the guy who invested in this derivative, well, he thinks, oh, I'm pretty good at selling things, I'll sell this on for 54 and I'll say it's worth more than it really is. So he sells it on for £54, all based on this guy, this homeless man, who's never going to pay off the original 55 at all. And this new guy does a runner. And this guy that he sold it on to thinks that he's getting 55 eventually, so he lends out a series of £10 to different people. And then they go and invest each of their £10 into something else. When all that comes crashing down, was it the homeless person's fault that it went on and on and on and on and on? Or is it these morons that keep selling on this false value that doesn't exist yet, gambling on whether the homeless man will pay it back or not? It's their fault. When you walk into a casino and play the blackjack table and lose, does somebody come along and bail you out because you lost? No, that's ridiculous. So why are the banks allowed to walk into a casino and play the mortgage table, and when they lose, they get bailed out? That's not fair. It's as simple as that. It's just not fair. And I think that's what Oscar needs to understand, that it wasn't the people borrowing, it was the lenders that built up this whole avalanche of toxic assets. And a good example in Britain is Northern Rock, who we bailed out, of course, because that's what happens. And basically what Northern Rock did was they based their entire business model on borrowing money from other banks. What they did was borrow money from other banks and then use this credit to lend out new credit to their customers in the form of mortgages. So they borrowed money, and then with that money they lent out money in the form of mortgages. That's risky in itself. And then what they did was collected the pool of mortgage debt, which we've just been talking about, and sold that on for a profit to other investors. So they repackaged their loans, their mortgages that they'd given out based on loans they'd taken themselves. So you can see why they failed, because their risk was, you can't get more risky than that. Everything is based on other people's money. And when the regular high street, people that just got normal bank accounts, got wind of some of this when it was finally, in the papers, they all en masse withdrew their deposits, which wiped out Northern Rock's reserves. So, due to their bad business practices, their gambling, their stupid repackaging of money that doesn't exist, they failed. Why on earth would we bail them out? Who does that help? If anything, during a banking collapse, it should be the government that bails out the people whose money got lost within the banks that crashed, rather than bailing out the banks who failed. The crash was caused by the lenders and the resellers and the gamblers, not the borrowers. And it's now been prolonged by the government who bailed out these scumbags. And that because they've been bailed out, the budget deficit and the national debt increases. So the people foot the bill no matter what. I don't think Oscar's truly looking into this deep enough.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question. What is money?
Money is a representation of wealth which you have already created, or at least that's what it should be.
And who produces money?
Well, money itself is produced by the banks, or in our case, the Bank of England produce it, and it's introduced into circulation to represent the productivity of work.
Well, the next point is basically money creation. And Oscar says the Bank of England creates money. Well, not anymore they don't, not really. The Bank of England maybe creates about 3% of money in circulation as notes and coins that they actually print. 90+% of today's money in Britain and the world is created out of thin air by the private banking system, by Lloyds, by NatWest, you know, these high street private banks. It's digits on a computer screen, and it's done through what's called the fractional reserve banking system. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but the common example given to make it easy for people to understand how this works is that banks operate on a 10% reserve ratio. And what that means is a bank can lend out, or say a bank started with £100 in deposits. You know, it's a mini bank. And they lend out £90, they only have to keep 10% back in reserves. It's digital now, so no money changes hands, and this £90 will ultimately be deposited in another bank. And then that bank can lend out £80, because it's still on the 10% reserve ratio, they can lend £80 out to somebody else. That person deposits it elsewhere, and a further 70 can be lent out. It can even go back to the same bank where it started. So what we have now is lots of money created out of thin air that the banks who created it then expect back with interest. And that, in a nutshell, is how they make money and how money is created. It's alchemy, it's magic, it's just computers on a screen. And when they get so greedy, creating this money out of thin air, that they sell and repackage loans and mortgages and create bubbles and toxic derivatives, false wealth, and it all comes crashing down, it's okay, because the government then bails them out. So they effectively have money machines that they type up, and then if something goes wrong, it's alright, because the government then types some more back in. But where does the government get its money from? Well, this is where it gets funny. The government gets its money from other banks and offshore investors and other, you know, any other way you can to get money, basically, any other big investor. But the government can never default because they make the people pay it back through cuts and taxes. And this is just a clever way of saying slavery. As Mayor Amschel Rothschild said, "Give me a control of a nation's money supply and I care not who writes her laws." So the government needs 500 million to invade another Middle Eastern country. How do they get that 500 million? They go to the Treasury, and the Treasury issues 500 million in government bonds or gilts. Think of them as pieces of paper saying IOU on them. Overseas investors, insurance companies, private banks, they purchase these IOUs, and now the government, which therefore means the people, are 500 million more in debt. And we have to pay that back with interest. And currently, we can only afford to make repayments on this national debt if we sell even more of these bonds to private institutions. In other words, we're stuck on a never-ending fishing line of credit and debt. The national debt is exponential. It will just keep increasing to the point where they're not even going to want to invest in countries anymore. But by that time, it doesn't really matter. It's still a control system. They've got all the wealth they need. Now it's about power. As long as they force cuts onto people and keep them enslaved in this system, it doesn't even matter at that point whether they get all the money back, because they still remain on top of the pyramid. And if you really want to know who owns this country, then all you've got to do is look at who creates the money and who lends money to the government. And it's private individuals, institutions, banks. And the puppets don't own this country. They don't own this country. The prime ministers, they have no power. And the people certainly have no power, because all they do is vote in the puppets that do the bidding of the bankers. And why do we do that? Why do we only vote in puppets? Well, because the mainstream media tells us there's only 3 choices, and 2 of which are already in a coalition. I think we'll ultimately end up with a 3-way coalition, which means there'll be no other parties ever again that can get in.
What I'm taking issue with you on is the fact that people out in the wider world are not to blame at all, and that they shouldn't have to suffer some of the consequences now for their part, not in whole, but their part of the blame for the problems that we're now suffering. We're all suffering from these problems, and it would be nice, really, if every particular party could take a proportion of punishment in accordance with how much they were responsible for having caused the problem in the first place. So the idiots that have gone out and bought houses thinking that they were just going to keep on going up and up and up, when any fool could see that eventually the housing bubble would burst and values would come down, if those people have lost their houses now, or if they've got mortgages that the repayments on that are crippling them, then in a sense, they were stupid. And shouldn't they accept? I mean, should they get a complete pass on that? Should they be allowed just to get away with that and not suffer any consequence of their own foolishness?
Well, Oscar says this as if it's relatively easy to get out of this national debt. And the way the media and the government portray it's almost like, oh, we'll have these cuts for a little while, and then the economy will be back on its feet again and everything will be fine. Well, no, the system has completely failed. We currently have a national debt of £4.8 trillion. That's thousands and thousands per person. On a global scale, there isn't enough money or assets in existence to pay off all the national debts. And as I said, the national debt will still increase exponentially every year, despite these cuts that we're facing. Cuts are futile. We've gone far too far in this. In Margaret Thatcher's time, at least it was possible to cut and save the system. Not that I think the system itself is worth saving anyway, but now you can't even save the system that's in place. It's failed. All it is now is an illusion, more so than it's ever been. It's impossible. Money itself, this is a point people forget. Money itself is created as debt. When a government borrows money, it's debt. When we borrow money, it's debt. And all money that's ever created is created as a debt. So we're always in a minus figure anyway. It's just who has the money written into their books and who doesn't. And it's always not us, is it? We never have the plus sign. We always have the negative sign. So regardless of who Oscar wants to blame, even then, the problem can't be solved with the same consciousness that created it. You can't get out of this failed economic system through cuts and all this. You can't get out of the system while still working within the system. The system itself has to go. We need a radical new system that in some way, in some roundabout way, null and voids this national debt completely. That's the only way out. It's either that or a recession forever, or a slight recovery and another recession, a slight recovery and another recession forever. It doesn't get better unless we change it.
All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it! My life has value.